just jump in? One of the reasons, if you remember, those of you yesterday, one of the significant aspects when it comes to the DRE that's different is because we're dealing with drugs. All of the experts agree that drugs have a very different effect from individual to individual, much more than alcohol. With alcohol, there's more research, at least in terms of the effects at certain levels that will happen. It's certainly not exact. But with drugs, it is so different because it depends on what you're taking the drug for. In other words, do you have an underlying medical condition? Does it matter how much of a dose you're taking? There's issues of tolerance and dependence. So realize that you could take a drug and potentially have the smooth pursuit. Could be from the drug, could be from the medical condition that you have underlying. The DRE, however, is claiming they can distinguish between whether the nystagmus is from a drug that's impairing or whether it's from a medical condition. And all of the experts were saying, as you can hear, that's just ridiculous. There's no way that they have the training to do that, number one. And frankly, the best ophthalmologist in the world is telling you he cannot do it, what they claim to do it. One of the very funniest things that we had is their optometrist, that was their superstar, the DRE superstar, travels all over the country to do these things. At one point, you'll see in the transcripts, conceded that he could not come into court and testify as the DRE does because he doesn't have a medical license. And that just shows you, to me, the ridiculousness of the DRE, that they bring in an optometrist to validate the program when that optometrist would be prohibited from rendering the same opinion they are because he's not properly qualified. This shows you a little bit about that.
You look around, you think, how old is the person sitting next to me? How old is the person behind me? Age affects smooth pursuit. Younger people have the ability to track more precise than older people. Does the DRE have the ability to figure that out? No, but that's an important fact. The issue of smooth pursuit speed is really important. And I think you see this all the time when you watch the DWI tapes too. They're doing the test and they're all over the place, right? But even when you focus in on what speed they're supposed to do it at, most of the time, a majority of normal, sober population can't do it at the test speed. I mean, we have research to back that up. They just can't do it at the test speed.
And that was significant for us too, because our judge at one point when we were in the back in the chambers says, you know what, I'll never look at HGN the same way again by the time we got done. Now, we at one point contemplated whether we should actually challenge HGN and all field sobriety tests altogether as well, but we didn't want to put a little bit too much on the plate for the judge. We're like, let's just leave that alone. But as you know, there certainly is a lot of challenges to the research that's done for that too. But in this particular field, it was really clear that the way they do it, our ophthalmologist was like, yeah, that's going to induce actually nystagmus because induce lack of smooth pursuit because the speed at which they're moving, most people's eyes can't travel that quickly.
Visual acuity is an issue. The smooth pursuit, lack of smooth pursuit doesn't affect visual acuity. Alcohol doesn't affect visual acuity. When you talk about nystagmus at maximum deviation, some people will have nystagmus before 4 seconds. Some people will have nystagmus during 4 seconds. Some people will have nystagmus appearing after 30 seconds. And the crux of the matter is that holding the eye maximum deviation for 4 seconds will not rule in drug-caused nystagmus and will not rule out naturally caused nystagmus. It doesn't mean anything. There's a substantial population of normal sober people that have naturally occurring nystagmus at maximum deviation. The angle of onset was something that was really interesting to see how they were going to approach this. Dr. Sitek is their optometrist, and Dr. Sitek said that he could measure the angle of onset to the nearest 1 degree without a protractor, without any sort of optometric, any sort of equipment. And it was just bizarre when he was up there telling the judge, yeah, I can measure the angle of onset to 1 degree. It just was unbelievable. Our ophthalmologist, of course, said that, he couldn't do it. He couldn't do it within 5 degrees without equipment.
Yeah, and I'll add on that too. We talked a little bit about yesterday. One of the reasons why they base HGN so heavily as, again, their first major indicator, the DRE position is that is evidence of driving impairment. And our experts were very clear that HGN is not a driving impairment because of the lack of visual, it doesn't affect visual acuity. And went through and explained that is why when you go get your license at the Motor Vehicle Administration or your local, HGN is not a disqualifier because it actually doesn't affect visual acuity, that there are people out there that have HGN naturally or some that have it by taking therapeutic doses. Now, in light of that, now realize you had, again, a top ophthalmologist testifying to this. Thomas Page went out and told all the DREs around the country after this, he doesn't know what he's talking about. It does, in fact, affect your driving. So there's no even recognition that maybe we need to re-examine our position from the DRE. It's like they just dig in and say, that ophthalmologist from Hopkins doesn't know what he's talking about. It affects visual acuity. But that was the reason why that was so significant, is because of that. And I'll talk a little bit about FARS. And that gets me to the next point on HGN. There's a thing that they utilize, the reason why they are actually trying to determine the exact angle of onset is because they're using this concept called the THARPS equation. It takes the number 50 minus the exact angle of onset, and they use that to determine what they believe to be your level of impairment. So let's say, for example, you have someone, they're arrested, they get a breath test, their reading is a .03. They go, geez, we think this person's messed up more than that. They do the exact angle of onset, they conclude that there was an onset at 30 degrees. They take the number 50 minus 30, and they get .20. They said, well, you're showing an impairment based on your angle of onset at .20, but your breath test is only a .03. It must be drugs. Something else is causing that impairment. They utilize that as a very early indicator of how this case is going to go. And that's what they do. They got to account for that extra .17 of impairment. What you'll find in many of your states is that HGN is only accepted to show the presence of alcohol and not even a certain amount. Some states vary on that, but in a lot of states, you can only use it you can't use it to show a level of impairment. But they do, and they use that as the exact angle of onset. That's why it was so ridiculous when they said they can be out there and they can do it within 1 degree. What's significant about this is that we had, again, all of our experts. We had our ophthalmologist from Hopkins. We had another, not only board-certified physician from Hopkins, but he writes the exams to become board-certified nationally. They both said, essentially, that is a fictional concept. Our ophthalmologist researched everywhere. And this was a researcher who had won an award from the National Institute of Health. Researched everywhere and said could find nothing anywhere that validated this concept of a THARPS equation. It was completely fabricated. And in fact, ultimately said that it was some distortion of Alexander's law, which is a concept that has nothing to do with impairment by drugs, but said that there was nothing out there. Even their own physician that they brought conceded that it wasn't validated anywhere. And certainly was something he had never been taught in law school. But you have to understand, that's the stuff that goes on with this program. There is literally no medical or scientific basis for a lot of this stuff, but yet they're using it to make decisions. And that's one of them.
When you talk about HGN scoring, the DRE is going to conclude that you're impaired by drugs if you score 4 out of 6, what our doctor indicated to us is that many non-impaired persons score 4 out of 6 on the HGN test. And that the way they do the test, there's an issue of unilateral disease that could come up. So 4 out of 6 doesn't mean anything.
Well, and the other point too, realize with DRE, what they've done is they've taken the field sobriety manuals and what essentially is done with a lot of stuff, but they're not necessarily abiding by those rules that even exist there in the DRE program. When they were asked how many indicators do you need to score HGN present, there's nothing that gives them any guidance. It could be 2. They could find 2 of 6 clues, and they could still say it's present. If you look at the manual, the DRE manual, it doesn't say how many indicators need to be there to find present. And that was another problem, is that from one DRE to the next, they could pretty much decide what they want to do.
The vertical gaze nystagmus is really interesting. The optometrist wanted to focus on the fact that they have a vertical gaze nystagmus test. If you look at the face sheet, it doesn't talk about vertical gaze nystagmus. It references vertical nystagmus. And in the world of ophthalmology, there's a big difference between vertical gaze nystagmus and vertical nystagmus. What Dr. Adams concluded was that there was no way in the world that the DRE could find either vertical gaze nystagmus nor vertical nystagmus. And the only way for an optometrist, if an optometrist could do it, would be to use very highly specialized equipment. So there's a right challenge for just a vertical gaze nystagmus fried.
And just to jump in on that point, we were talking earlier about Oregon. Vertical gaze nystagmus is one of those things that, again, I think is very much a law enforcement creation. There's absolutely no research that supports that VGN is an indicator of a high level of drug impairment or alcohol impairment, as they like to claim. Some courts, I think, bought off on that very early. Oregon was one of them initially that accepted the DRE program, but then subsequent decision when the VGN was challenged, they ultimately came back and said, well, wait a second, we weren't accepting the program as a whole. If you're challenging it individually, then we'll listen to those arguments. So I think the VGN component is something that most of you could seriously challenge in your states, even if they've accepted the DRE program previously. Yeah.